All right, guys. So
We just can't go.
everyone gather around. Gather around. I hope the
Okay,
audio doesn't
everyone,
cut out.
gather
We'll
close.
see. But come close. Come close.
It's Psych and I tonight, and we're gonna
Yeah.
take you on a journey through the collapse of society. It'll be fun.
Yeah, we're going to
Just
different
relax.
worlds.
Remember
We'll go
that
to different
everyone
worlds.
will die someday.
We're gonna go to another room to talk about collapse, and it has some collapse-related facts in it, and it's just really important. I think this topic in general can be a very kind of, it can lead someone to feel distressed and hopeless and things like that. But, I think it's important to remember that for every fact that we're going to be talking about tonight related to the potential collapse of society, that there is a potential, way that we can address those problems and work together to solve them.
Should we head over there?
Yeah, let's go.
Thank you. All right, here we go.
I wanna see a change tonight.
Okay, so are we ready to get started? Is everyone?
Yeah.
I mean, I know some people are still gathering in.
Ewan is the community spotlight, so maybe let's do that first. And
Oh,
then we can
right.
go into that.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, so I know that we're talking about the future, obviously, like where you think society is going, but also maybe we can start at where you think society is right now.
World currently is unstable, but stable. Because, viewing through history, the stability of things, there are more people in the world than ever.
Mhm.
Each different person has their own idea of what's going on. And I feel it increases the amount of people who say things are not going well, but also going well. So you get mixed ideas.
So we're in the state of extremes, you're saying. So we've got a high population, we've got lots of negative stuff going on, lots of positive stuff going on, and it's like making the future unclear. So, but where do you think the future could lead? Like, where is this state of extremes getting us?
Yeah.
Well, hopefully, if people can get a hang of things that are really actually getting extreme, like climate environments, I feel it could get better with time in a more stable state where people could, instead of going on a slow decline, what you could maybe call a collapse, to at least slightly positive outlook where technology progresses and just generally it's nicer. Well, not nicer. I feel there's still lasting damage that's going to be done.
But you think we'll recover?
It'll be
think that there won't be a specific point at which
there might be
collapsing.
Like a collapse could be quite relative. Like there could be a collapse in fish population or rainforests, but I feel in general if they're taking a handle of that, collapse could be stopped, or well, at least slowed and then put into a state where it could recover. How long it would take to recover, I don't know, but I feel it's possible to have it slowed.
Yeah.
All right, cool. So we could lead to more
pretty
stability.
Optimistic. You, and also I think it's interesting. You make a really good point that I hadn't thought about, that collapses can happen without like a total collapse, which I think is a really interesting thing. And I mean, how do you define a collapse?
Just a reduction in something's potential. Like you could, if you take it in a literal form, a person could collapse to the floor, but they can still get up again.
I get knocked down.
They could fall to some degree, but they can still recover. You can have like a slow collapse as well, in which I'd say is the more dangerous type, as a slow collapse could be something that's over many years, and it's so slow that only a few people really notice about it, or since it's so slow, care about it.
Okay.
Yes.
Which I guess you could apply to environment. But,
Yeah. Pretty easily.
I think that's happening. It could be happening. We won't keep it speculative since
there's
none
some
of us
stuff
know.
happening. Like whatever's happening with the climate is one thing, but there's a mass extinction going on, right? Like lots and lots of animal species are dying out at really, really high levels. But because it's happening at a specific rate that it doesn't affect us immediately. So it's that slow like decline into like a different state of being, you know, like our planet is going to be different, but we're not really noticing like as it's getting there.
I see it as we're in the events leading up to part of history. Honestly, the whole world's just spiraling down the drain right now, as far as I can tell.
And
we're going to look back on it, and history's going to claim this period as the events leading up to whatever catastrophe may befall us.
Do you think that's part of human nature? I mean, this is a question that we have later in discussion, but, you know, do you think that's part of human nature? Is that just like, have we evolved to always be thinking about, like, there's a sense of purpose that it actually instills when you think that the whatever 90 years that we're going to be alive or whatever is meaningful enough for some kind of significant transition to happen. But does everyone think that all the time? Is that like part of how we've evolved to exist and perceive our reality?
For some, that may be true, but for others, I mean, by the variety of people we got here, everybody will have their own viewpoint on it.
There's always a sense of when change happens, whether the change is good. There could be good aspects to things collapsing, I guess, like, say, the coal industry. And if that goes away, then that means there's less carbon emissions and it's better for the environment, but that means people are out of jobs. And there's like their world is collapsing, but for many others, or for everyone else, or everyone in general, it's slightly better. So I definitely think it's just in people's natures to think about the collapse, because then it enables them to prepare to change, to try and adapt to it.
Thank you for sharing your thoughts. I think that's like a pretty good introduction to our episode, which is about collapse, which also known as which is also like known as the apocalypse, right? Like we're talking about the end of the world as we know it, whatever that looks like. If it's an end to civilization, it could be an end to humanity. It could be like just whatever's gonna make us fall apart. I mean, that's kind of a scary thought, but it is also something that we have been talking about for like years and years and years. I mean, like old texts and old stories will talk about the end of the world as well. What's the difference between predicting that the world is going to end when they did it thousands of years ago to when we're doing it now?
For the purposes of this discussion, I think for all of us, like, we could get into a debate, I think, about whether there's going to be a collapse, but I think instead it's more interesting to have a discussion just about the general construct of a collapse and what the possibilities are and the history and past. And your question is really interesting about, like, is there a difference? I think that one potential difference that we have now is that the relationship, so collapse in general, what are we talking about collapsing? It's like a society or a system. And I think right now we have an unusual relationship between the people in the system and those that maintain it in terms of the ability to exert control and surveillance and all those kinds of things. Like I think now, like, there's a big difference in the relationship between people and the government. I think that's creating a lot of barriers to implementing solutions that could prevent collapses. So we see like financial, like Wall Street and things like that.
Is my relationship with the government different from like some, ancient Roman citizen, relationship with their government? Is that a different thing?
I mean, does anyone know? I'm actually throwing this out to the audience. Can anyone give a synopsis of exactly how, like, Rome collapsed?
Do you have any historians here?
Any historians?
This is something I should be read up on, and I don't have any idea.
It says in 476 CE, Romulus, the last of the Roman emperors in the West, was overthrown by the Germanic leader Adosair, who became the first barbarian to rule Rome. The order that the Roman Empire had brought to Western Europe for 1,000 years was no more. That's the quick.
That sounds like a cultural, like the culture was overthrown. Sounds like by some other force.
The problem with the question we were asking earlier is how complex that is. It wasn't just like one thing; it was a multitude of things.
Yeah. That's what I hear too. Is that like nobody's like determining causal factors for any past event is really, really complicated, and all you can do is really speculate. I mean, but that's the same here. We're trying to determine causal events for what, our end of the world will be. But, it's hard to know what will be the actual, what will actually cause it. So, like, Ewan mentioned the coal industry, and that, taps into a collapse of energy or an economic collapse, and how that could lead to, something in our world falling apart.
Well, like you say, the financial collapse, I can see that happening. And for me personally, the major part of the problem is so few have so much. CEOs, stockholders, and all that. When our government can stop kissing the corporate booty and start looking after the people instead, that's when you're going to start seeing change. Because right now, the governments are in the corporate pockets. And as long as he got that, well, then Joe Blow, the CEO, is going to make a crap load of money while he's got 10,000 people laid off. But the thing they don't realize is the more people they get rid of, the more the economy suffers, because now that's 10,000 people that aren't making a wage, that aren't buying stuff, and if they're not buying stuff, nothing gets made. If nothing gets made, that's even more people that get laid off. But it's kind of like this vicious circle.
It's interesting. There's this talk about loss of jobs as a potential form of collapse, but automation, I think, is going to, whether people are laying off or not due to a financial collapse, I think that we're going to head there anyway. That we have to figure out, we have to reconcile as a society how to, and you're making great points too, that we have to redistribute.
I think it brings up a good point, though, is that the system of capitalism that we're in, and this, the hierarchy of whoever has the most money, makes the rules, and then
greed. It's just plain greed.
Yeah. So our current system is constructed on that, and it's not designed to be a stable system. It's not designed to persist into thousands of years. I mean, what I hear from about other countries is that nothing else has really worked really well either, right? So China's in communism right now, and that's they're having difficulty with that. When Russia tried that, it was a bad time for them, I hear. North Korea's got some sort of totalitarian dictatorship, and I don't think that's working out for them. There's what system can we, have we designed that is designed for stability and not
Well, how many of them have been tested under the right conditions too? I'm just saying that I think that there's been the Red Scare or the U.S.'s whole thing to over. I'm not saying communism is the answer or anything, but I do think there's been a lot of meddling in other governments that are trying to set things up. That kind of have we actually tested out all of these systems? And the U.S. is only a couple hundred years old. It's are we seeing the kind of natural cycle of this great experiment?
To test these things out, you have to implement it into society and then watch it happen and see whether the society collapses or not. How
that's interesting. That's interesting. Maybe one use of AI will be able to simulate societies eventually and be able to predict, what system might
that would take a lot of complexity, though, wouldn't it?
Yeah, quantum computing probably or something.
There we go.
Complexity, and if the people are willing to allow the change as well, or unless they want to stick to the old ways that are so far working for them.
Yeah, the cultural element is a huge one.
Sometimes I feel like the community itself will collapse itself because it's too rigid and unwilling to change. I've seen it all the time in MMOs where they make a small update, but the community really hates it because it's
RuneScape.
It's changing from the norm that they were used to.
When you talk about the HP skill turning into Constitution and then increasing the rates by times 10, that should be completely under the water update. But people had to make a riot about it and quit the game for God knows what. So
so you're saying in order to survive, a community has to be flexible.
I actually had one other comment from Sarah too, just real quickly.
Yeah.
She was mentioning that when it comes to the systems are fine. Humanity itself is the source of the problems.
The nature of human beings.
So we're just doomed, no matter what we try, because our nature is inherently
because people are fucking assholes. That's why.
Society is doomed. We're all gonna die one day.
Yes, much.
That's what we're talking
Sarah
about.
says pretty much.
Yeah,
because we're all fucking assholes.
Yeah.
That's why.
But here's the thing. here's the thing. For all the assholishness going on in the world and everything, like, those are the stories that get told, right? Like, we hear on the news every day about, like, violence and escalating international tension and, like, all
Donald
the bad
Trump
things
getting
happening.
2 scoops of ice cream.
Right, so, like, these stories are in particular are being told. What's the ratio of that to stories that aren't being told? Whoa. But, like, okay, so in my day-to-day life, throughout my day, I see people, like, solving problems, interacting in a friendly way, like, having interesting conversations. Like, there's positive stuff going on all the time as well, and these stories aren't being told. We're, like, the stories that get told are the ones that are the scariest ones.
Yeah.
But how big are they in comparison to what else is going on?
It would be more along the lines of how those stories are portrayed through the media, because that falls again into what Catapult over there was talking about, that greed.
Mm-hmm.
The way some news reports is just to sit there and garner views and get more subscriptions to them so they can make even more money off of it.
Like,
so Sarah
and I mean,
on that too.
There are some news outlets, but
she was just adding that it's news is a control mechanism for the populace, or the news stories rather.
Well, it's interesting because any news source, like, for example, I am pretty anti-mainstream media. I think a lot of people blindly trust sources of mainstream media, and I've seen in recent events that there's a narrative being perpetuated. But then it's interesting because if you think about any media source, as you pointed out, Poplopo, like, any media source has to select from a trove of information, and they have to present it in some way, and they are by definition presenting a narrative. So that's a pretty big conundrum, I think.
I think it is, because, like, we're like, we know about our world based on the stories that are told to us, and, like, yeah, we can say that some sources are more reputable than others, but they're still putting together a story to tell us. So, like, that is a method of control, or at least influence, is that they're deciding what we hear, and that will, like, just that filters our experience and our, like, quote unquote knowledge of the world. Like, our understanding of what's going on is being actively shaped by the stories that we hear. Like, we can't come to an independent conclusion because we are kind of like, how else do we get this information except from this? Like, the world is too big. We have to get information from somewhere.
Yeah. Like Poplopo said about the positive, there's been a lot of positive, like, let's say just in the last 30 years, people started seeing that we were ruining our planet. So they started doing things to start cleaning up the water, start cleaning up the atmosphere, going from leaded gas to unleaded gas and all that, which really helps. There's been a lot of good done. It's not all bad, but, it's kind of like you said, let's try and look at some of the positives, and that's some of them.
Good news! There's a report on TV with some very bad news.
In my opinion, I guess, like, if there was a collapse, I feel like that the people who are slightly more prepared than the others somehow, and maybe this is just a fantasy, that, like, if there was a collapse, that people who've slightly prepared, who could last a little bit longer, who have, like, water filters, who have means of protecting themselves if other people are kind of, like, going crazy and, like, rioting and looting places and stuff like that. If people are more prepared, does that mean that for some way that they would last long enough to be among, like, some number of people who are able to survive? Because I think, you made a really good point that collapses happen. Like, collapse, just like you said, the definition of someone falling down and getting back up. I think that's, so the question is, if someone falls down and they break a bunch of bones, are we individuals, the bones in the body, or there's a lot more people, so it's not really equivalent to a bone, but, like, are we the bones that are broken, or do we survive?
So you're talking about, instead of trying to prioritize, like, fixing our systems and, like, trying to reshape our society to make it so that it doesn't collapse, we should prioritize, as an individual, just, like, our personal chances of survival.
So you do both. I think, there's this guy, Chris Hedges, who I really, really like. I recommend people look him up on YouTube. It's really interesting. He has really interesting thoughts about all this. And he talks about, like, the different collapses that have happened that he's covered in war and, like, Yugoslavia and things like that. He said, this was like 5 or 6 years ago, he said that because of the economic disparities, he said, there's two things that can happen. One is that socialism starts to creep in, where people who are in disadvantaged parts start to kind of rebel and say, no, this isn't. So the other thing is that nationalistic kind of like authoritarian figure can come to power through that dissatisfaction with people with the economy. This was 5 or 6 years ago. There's videos on YouTube of him talking about this, and so I feel what I feel is different now is that we're seeing this slow process of our country. I'm really talking about the United States, but I think that the global economy is also tightly linked to it. That we're starting to see this, and we're seeing like the things like Brexit and all these other kind of things that are just starting to occur. And I'm not saying whether they're right or wrong or anything like that, but like, there's something different here that's starting to happen. And I think that's that's what's drawing my attention to this kind of discussion about collapse.
Well, like nationalism isn't the answer, right? Nationalism is our history. That's our past. That's how things have collapsed before is through this segregation of community, saying, no, I'm different from you because I happen to be born on this patch of soil instead of that patch of soil, therefore I'm better than you, and we should live separately and conduct our lives. You know, we shouldn't care about each other's interests because we happen to be like slightly in less proximity than to each other. Like, how is that the answer?
Well, yeah, it's not the answer, it's a reaction. It's a societal reaction that's occurring. That's an indicator, I think, of where we stand in that process of potential collapse. It's a sign. So it's like it's a fever. I mean, it's like, you know what? It's seriously, it's very similar to a fever. You know, we have a fever.
I've actually heard that before. Yeah, it's counterintuitive, right? Because it seems like the more optimized solution would be to like become more united and like work together a bit more to help prevent this, like, whatever threat. But like, isn't that what we did back before when our species was young, when we were in like our hunter-gatherer societies? We did band together to face the threat of whatever it is.
Well, I think it's happening. The thing is that we have the 1%, or like not even just the 1.01%, like elite people who are able to kind of rule over and stuff, who have a lot of control. That is their tribe. You know, not everyone in there, obviously. These are not generalizations, but I think that, you know, there are limits to the size of an in-group and things like that. So, but, you know, back to the preparing part, which I think is like really interesting. I think that, like, for example, I grew up in DC, and my dad always had me keep at least half a tank full gas at all times, just in case something happened. To have like, you have like two, you know, however many miles. And if you happen to be on like empty or something like that when that happens, and if that happens, and, you know,
it's good to have good habits. So, man, I would really rather focus on like preventing the collapse rather than like just, I'm like, that seems like it's taking nationalism like to the other extreme and saying like, well, since everyone's going to die, I'm going to make sure that I and my people survive, you know, when every other person doesn't. Well, because like my attention is finite. I have to put it somewhere. And I'd rather devote it to...
You're still driving your car, you know, like you're still driving your car around, and you can choose when to fill up, things like that. Like, you know, it's like you're still doing your real life, you know, going about working, going to protest, activist, trying to rally people to be better and help the world. But at the same time, give you a gas tank half full or more or whatever. I mean, I don't know. It's just I think it's possible. It doesn't mean that you're giving up on the system. It just means that there's a level of caution and skepticism about where things are heading that is a level of preparedness to potentially be able to make do with any kind of situation.
I guess my question is, what needs to happen in the world so that we can survive this? Like, if an economic collapse, if we have the threat of economic collapse, what has to be in place to make sure that we don't have economic collapse? Do we have to make sure that the currency amount stays at a particular level? Do we have to make sure that certain industries keep operating?
I wouldn't say I know much about economics, but wouldn't like having... I think that having a capitalist society is somehow counterproductive, because eventually you have the people that capitalize so much that, like you've said, have all this money and power that can just basically control certain aspects of society. And that controlling of aspects of society can be beneficial for the one person that has all the money, but you know, proportionally it could affect, like what Catapult was saying, tens of thousands of people's jobs. So it makes
right.
sense to me to take out the one person that is affecting so many lives and, well, remove our capitalist tendencies in society, which is easier said than done.
We're getting to the point where a lot of the people in the higher ups are making the money, and it starts trickling down. What makes us different from something like the Banana Republic, where the people that owed all the banana companies like Dole and Chobana were making all of the money to the point where they control the government? How does that separate us from them as the U.S. government?
Well, is there a difference? Like, I mean, that's sort of in a large part how it works, right? I mean, not directly, but like the people who have the most powerful corporations in our nation, they have the money to lobby for legal changes, and like it's not a direct like decision about how our government is structured, but it's very forcefully indirect. If you can't afford to fight a legal battle, then the other guy wins. So that's where the money comes in.
Compared to people in other third world countries, are we the same as the CEOs? You know, it's just an interesting question about like, compared to someone who's living on $5 a month or whatever, or like less than $1 a day, are we the CEOs to them that the CEOs are to us? But Catapult, what did you?
You were talking about economic collapse. We just have to look in the last century here, the Great Depression of the 30s. That was economic collapse, and I believe what saved that was World War II.
It's kind of disheartening, right? Like, if we have an economic collapse, the only way to get out of it is more violence. Goody, right? Yay, let's do that. Like, that doesn't seem like a good way to pursue it.
I'm from what you call a third world country. So I think I have the two different opinions on what you were saying. So
please share.
First of all, is the Banana Republic analogy. I think it's a bit misguided, and I don't mean to undermine your opinion, but in my country, for example, there was a big company that controlled a big part of the production in the country, and I think it's a bit more complicated than just CEOs controlling the whole thing. In the US, I think it's about one company and their supply that I think it's not comparable to the situation in the US, because people they didn't even use to get money. They just gave like bonuses that they could change inside the same company to get food and to get housing, and they were basically trapped. And the other thing I wanted to say was that, for example, in my country, a person gaining like $30,000 a year is a lot of money. Like, people here normally get like 20,000 to 30,000, and people who gain like 50,000, that is like a very rich person. So I think it's comparable. I mean, I'm not from a like super poor country, but I think Americans don't realize how lucky they are. Like, they can visit the world, and for me, visiting the world is like, it's a huge expense. And for example, this VR headset is incredibly expensive here. And actually, I'm using one from a friend who lent it to me. So I think that's my experience in it.
Yeah, that's a very good viewpoint on it. And where are you from?
I'm from Costa Rica.
I think the thing when you said the people having jobs and being trapped, it's interesting because, look, there are people here who we talk about Wall Street, but at the same time, a lot of us have friends, or some of us have friends who are going into banking or working in the financial district or working for the military industrial complex. And like, so we have the simultaneous thing where it's like, yes, maybe the company or the entity is negatively influencing our society, but then there's people who are operating that, who are kind of held captive in a way.
Social engineering.
Not everyone is.
Yeah, so I mean, it kind of depends on like I guess, I mean, there's a lot of different factors, but I know that like that sort of situation where like you're in a company and then that company is also like responsible for your like having your shelter and your food, like that's where you get everything because you're dependent on them. Like that happens in China as well. Like they have entire cities that are basically just one company, and then everybody lives there and like works there. I mean, talk about like corporations having influence over society. Like that's over like the day-to-day lives, far more intense than I think that we have here. I'm curious too about the stability of that as well. Like, Like, is it more stable or less stable, regardless of how undesirable it is?
It's hard to know. I mean, other countries have been around a lot longer than we have, but they've gone through their own collapses as well. So it's a...
Yeah.
The statement that the only way that we got out of the Great Depression was with another war to rebuild the economy. I don't know that we didn't join World War II as a way to get out of the depressions. I mean, we were still pursuing isolationism and just trying to do a little bit to help England. But anyways, the main problem, I think, is that very few of the ultra-rich that were running the country at the time, as far as like the very large corporations, none of them wanted to sacrifice their standard of living and what they were used to and change the system to bring the country back to a better place. They were more happy to watch everyone else suffer while they still lived in their crystal palaces, essentially.
For human behavior to change, there has to be a motivation for that change. And if rich people are the only people that can change the world, but they don't have the money, or they do have the money, but they don't have the motivation to do so, then it's not going to happen. Like, we can talk about how greedy it is for capitalism to exist, and that's true and everything, but we are animals fundamentally. Like, we have motivations, we have we have patterns that guide our behavior, and part of that is motivation. For instance, I don't think any of us feel happy about conditions in third world countries, but I'm not willing to not have my phone, for instance, which was made in China under labor conditions that I consider inhumane, but I'll still buy a phone, and because that's my motivations are geared towards my current context, and my current context happens to be one that requires use of a phone. So the context has to influence the shape of the behavior.
But even deeper than the phone being manufactured in a facility where it's poor work conditions in the factories that do that, but the materials to build that phone come from places that are even worse.
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah.
Outsourcing.
Completely destroying Africa and its people to gather up the raw materials to build these components to put inside these phones.
So I'm here at the middle class consumer level, and I'm making my decisions based on my context. You go higher up and you go to the CEO level, and they are making decisions based on their context. So if you've got a rich, successful person, they've got they're managing a whole bunch of businesses, it just doesn't make sense in a human brain to just throw that all away for an entirely different context than the one that they're currently operating in.
It doesn't make sense, but I think at the same time, the entities that we have, the fact that we have, and this is capitalism, the fact that we have one CEO that's running a whole company. Uber is a great example of this. I drove for Uber for 3 years, and you could see, I mean, just part-time, just on the side or whatever. And I'm lucky because people who did drive for Uber full-time were screwed as Uber lowered its prices and basically continued to kind of screw the drivers over. And why? Because they need to increase their profits. They need to, they're at a loss, they're operating at a loss right now. So that is one thing, but we're seeing that companies can't exist that are creating a livable way. And this is universal basic income also coming into here. But companies can't exist right now where people just live a livable wage and they don't have to keep growing. So many companies have to keep growing because of the stock market, and then they become cannibalistic. Especially if we consider a company a person in legal terms, then the company is cannibalistic in terms of how they're interacting with their humans and all that kind of stuff,
exactly.
Which I think leads to
it's systematic in that it's this is our system right now, and the way it operates. These are emergent properties of the system just based on how our economics work, how we go about exchanging value with each other, how we go about just living our lives and what we need. So it's all of these variables leading to the situation that we can't get out of because there's no immediate motivation to do so.
We're starting to see it. I think we're starting to see the fomenting of a movement and the growing of resistance and things like that. But will it be enough? I'm not sure. I saw The Architect.
There's just something related to, I guess, basically everything we've been talking about that I think humans, I believe, we are always trying to aim towards this critical mass where it's not easy for us to do something a little bit. So I feel like, well, when we're trying to talk about solutions, how can we prevent things from happening? What are the steps we need to take to make, preventative measures and whatnot? And I think that as a concept might just be something that's difficult for humans in general. I think that, like you were just saying with corporations about how, it's not in the best interest necessarily of a corporation to get to a point where they're a comfortable size. There always seems to be this need to continuously grow, and I feel like that extends even beyond just companies in general. Like we were talking about Rome earlier. Rome probably could have lasted for even longer than it did had it grown to a size where it felt it was comfortable, but there always seems to be this drive, this human drive, to reach that level of critical mass where then something either happens of a positive nature or of a negative nature. Maybe for a majority of the human race, it takes reaching that critical mass to enact any kind of change or reaction to consequence.
That makes sense. That's some interesting thoughts. So in that regard, could collapse be a good thing? You see this in animal populations sometimes, where there's an overcrowding problem, and so a bunch of the animal population dies out, and then they're able to, the ecosystem kind of rebalances itself, and then it can live in a more balanced state of mind. I don't like encouraging the idea of collapse, but is that a possibility?
I've actually had this thought for quite a while, is it may take a collapse to kick humanity's collective rear to finally get us off of going for that greed, going for more money and everything, to finally banding together as the human race as a whole, not just white, black, Chinese, Russian, American, Venezuelan, anything like that. It may be a collapse that pushes us towards that final goal of
that's interesting.
Having that whole human race peace on Earth.
It's funny. That sounds hopeful to me. That's funny that you're oh no, I hope that doesn't happen to me. I'm there's some hope in the potential collapse.
I don't want so many people to die in order for us to learn how to get along. That seems like a sort of a Pyrrhic victory to me.
But that brings the question of, has humanity fallen that far to where they do need to have that happen to finally see the big picture of we need to change as a whole?
You don't need a necessarily real collapse. You just need to shock people with cold water. If you can find something that can do that, then that would be as effective.
I feel like technology it's going to change a lot of things, and it doesn't necessarily have to be a full collapse where a lot of people die, but a culture change. So I don't agree with the idea that we really need the death of many people. I think we still have the chance to change through technology. I've always felt kind of like a transhumanist. I like the idea that technology could change people, and I know there's a lot of problematic stuff in that. But for example, if technology changed the industry and people would see the need for universal basic income, then there will be the need for the full death of many people.
So what the architect was saying about how there could be a soft collapse, more or less, I think we've already come across a few of those. Because everyone remembers last year how it was a terrible year politically for the whole world. We had Britain and Brexit, and a lot of people wanted to actually leave the European Union, and they were all given this this basically fake advertising and promotion, the context that they would get rid of the immigrants, that the National Health Service would get £350 million a week for services, and that was just completely and utterly false. They were lies straight out the bat, but people still believed them and based their vote on them. So I hope that this the shock of what actually is going to happen when we leave the EU will put us into a better state of mind to not believe what the media tells us, to do our own research, and to become a better society because of it. And in comparison, the USA, you probably had a very hard time choosing which president you wanted. But a lot of people probably didn't even consider that there was a third option or more to go through.
Yeah.
And everyone keeps having this mindset that third-party votes for president are a wasted vote. And
well, because that's
it's
the
like
pattern, and like, yeah.
Oh, yes, but you don't have to choose Hillary or Trump. If you truly believe the views of what the third person is saying is what you want for the country, then why not put the vote in that? It's not a popularity contest.
Right. The parallel between both of these things too is the story that the media tells. Like, this is what the media tells us. Like, and so they provide the information, and so the public reacts to that information and, you know, react however they're going to react. But the influence comes from the people telling the story, providing the information. So, like, they're providing information about what will happen to Britain, you know, to, like, if Britain leaves the EU, or they're providing information about what will happen if you vote a third party. Like, they're the ones telling the story, and then, like, the only other thing, like, you have to either react to that or disbelieve it, and, like, just you're fighting an uphill battle the entire way if you, like, looking for alternative narratives. Like, it's
media is creating a story because they know how people are going to react, and so they create these stories to get this reaction. That's what I see. But speaking of which, let's stick with the collapse thing. I would suggest that maybe you take a look at that movie/turn documentary, Idiocracy. I think that's a really great example of Idiocracy. I don't know if you've seen Idiocracy. It's really great. It's a comedy, but it's actually whenever I see, I've seen it many times, and every time I see it, I think it's more like a documentary, and that's a great idea of what the collapse is going to be like. Ladies and gentlemen, the President of America.
Shit. I know shit's bad right now, with all that starving bullshit, and the dust storms, and we running out of French fries and burrito coverings.
I think that people might be working with the wrong set of data. Like, the idea going back to Bangladesh, and like, there is places on Earth, if you look at Syria, North Korea, and pockets of places that are still very bad off. But if you look at the data, the world's getting better for the majority of the people over the last 20 years has been incredible. And we're actually at the largest percentage of the world is fed. The smallest percentage of the world is dying to homicide at any time, and to disease at any time ever. And if you look at it, everybody worries about the population explosion, right? Well, we have actually had less children born year after year since 1990. And it goes, this year, we had the lowest percentage growth of population of any year since records were ever kept, since the 1940s. And it's going to continue.
Is that North America?
That's Earth. That's Earth.
Earth. Okay,
Millennials are doing something right for once. Hey.
Oh, no. No, what it is. Find the talks of Hans
Millennials killed
Rosling.
overpopulation.
And then many call this exponential growth. Have you heard the term exponential growth? This is exponential, faster and faster and faster. Since 1960, we have had no exponential growth whatsoever. We've had an absolutely linear growth. But there's so much crap written and said about population growth. So they just put in these X's, explosion, exponential. And you argue for things based on scare, trying to scare people, instead of making them understand.
Hans Rosling has done like 3 TED Talks, and he talks about the World Health. He's part of the World Health Organization, and the data shows that the idea of the third world doesn't even barely exist anymore. And also, these places people talk about that we feel sorry for, that we call the third world. Many of these people live very happy lives. Like, most of the world have lived joyous lives. They just don't live at the same level as us, but that doesn't mean they're like they live at the level we did in 1970.
Interesting point.
Very few people, a very small percentage of the population is actually starving, and most of the world's population that is starving are in very specific pockets of famine or war. So to me, it's just a mistake to think that our world's in decline. America and the Western world is losing status compared to what we used to call the third world, but the world itself is not in decline.
Well, for example, I will have to talk about my own country, and I feel like I visited the United States a few times, and the difference isn't that big right now. I mean, it used to be bigger, because when people make comparisons between countries, they compare the I think the income per capita by year, and obviously, if you look at a third world country, they'll be making a lot less money, but people are not considering that food, for example, is much cheaper in third world countries, and food here is much cheaper than in the United States. The electronics are extremely expensive here, but food and basic commodities have been getting cheaper. And lastly, I personally feel like third world countries is a remnant of the Cold War, so I don't really like the term, but I feel like people should be talking about in developing countries and developed countries.
Okay.
So that's all I wanted to say.
That makes sense.
Thanks for that. I love the fact that in this discussion we're able to have someone from a developing country be able to provide, that kind of insight. That's really cool.
Yeah,
and Catapult, what you're saying too, is really interesting to hear, his response and stuff too.
Yeah, I agreed. I liked what he had to say.
But yeah, well, I guess, it's about time to wrap it up. I feel like that's a pretty good nugget of wisdom about, perspective on developing countries and everything.
My final, I guess I just want to say,
we should,
talking about all this can be really frustrating. I don't know how hopeful I feel, but I generally feel, I guess, positive about humanity, which is why I want humanity to survive in the first place. It hurts to think about us collapsing because I want us to succeed. I think most of us are freaking cool, and I want us to keep going. So I hope that.
Yeah. And you know what? What's really cool, guys, is that here we are from other countries, from other parts of the world, all together talking about this. And you know what? This is bringing us across these borders away from the people in control who can, stop someone from a developing country from being able to provide that perspective to a bunch of us or whatever. And so I think that the community that we're building here in VRchat can be a way to prevent collapse and help improve the world and make it a better place. So
I like that. So yeah, keep it up, guys.
Yeah, Owlboy.
I feel like a George Costanza quote might be useful. Like how he likes to be like, "We live in a society."
I was here first.
Well, if you were here first, you'd be holding the phone.
We're living in a society. We're supposed to act in a civilized way.
I think a lot of people forget that. And that's the key to making this work, right?
For our group picture, maybe we can do the arms over the shoulders or something to be like, we're all together, we're going to prevent the collapse. Yes. I like that.
Together.
All right, let's take it. Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I can do that.
This is so fucking cool. We need to be next to each other.
Right? Like, your guys is right. I'm just trying to make the composition of the picture more interesting.
Let me just...
A little more.
Oh my god,
Your mic is...
Thank you!
As I look about me, I see it's a revolution that you see. There's changes you want to see.